Susanna was not always like this. In the distant memories of her mind, she was a woman full of dreams and hope, but now, she had become a mother marked by coldness, as if all the love she once had frozen forever. There was no sweetness in her gaze, only a hardness that seemed to pierce anyone who dared to look at her. For Clara, barely 12 years old, and her little sister Alice, only 1 year old, being under their mother's control was a true torment. Susanna did not know calm. She only screamed, and her shouts echoed against the walls of their home like sounds filling every corner with fear. Each day was the same as the last: screams, cries, and the constant dread that something worse would happen. The house that should have been a place of peace had turned into a prison of suffering, innocent and small. Alice cried incessantly. Her soft, high-pitched wails filled the air with anguish, and Clara, though so young, tried to protect her as best she could. She knew that if their mother lost her patience, everything would become even worse. The responsibility of caring for her sister was an enormous burden for someone so small, but Clara had no choice. "Shh, Alice, don't cry," Clara whispered, hugging her sister tightly, trying to calm her as the baby's tears soaked her own clothes. "I'm here with you. I will take care of you. I won't let Mama hurt you." But how could a girl protect another when she couldn't even protect herself? Clara lived in fear, with that constant knot in her throat that never went away, and with the feeling that at any moment, everything would crumble. Susanna's fury seemed limitless. There was something dark within her, something that consumed her more each day, and the reason for such cruelty had a much deeper origin. Susanna had not always been this way. Everything changed the day her husband, the man she trusted, decided to abandon her. When Susanna became pregnant with Alice, he fled without looking back, leaving no note, giving no explanations. He simply disappeared, leaving her alone and pregnant with a small child to care for. That betrayal was the spark that ignited the fire of hatred in her heart. Since then, everything had changed. The pain she felt transformed into anger, and that anger was directed at those who least deserved it, her daughters. One night, the silence was heavier than usual. Clara was awake, making sure Alice didn't cry too loudly. She knew that any sound could wake their mother. When that happened, the storm would soon arrive. But that night, instead of the usual screams, she heard something different: the muffled sobs of her mother from the other room. Clara felt a shiver run through her body. She had never heard her mother cry. What did it mean? Susanna's weeping was not from physical injury but from someone who was hurt inside, and Clara, despite her age, understood. "Mom," Clara whispered to herself, daring not to move. For a moment, she wanted to get up, go to her mother's room, and see what was wrong. Maybe, just maybe, her mother needed someone, and she, though only 12, could be that someone. But fear paralyzed her. What if her mother saw her? What if she scolded her for meddling? What would happen if, instead of comfort, it all ended in more shouting? Meanwhile, Susanna continued to cry in the darkness of her room, mourning the life she once dreamed of, a life that had vanished the day her husband left her. She cried for the man who had betrayed her, for the dreams that would never come true, for the happiness that had faded away, and though her tears fell like a silent rain, there was no redemption in them. When the sun rose again, Susanna got up with more bitterness in her heart, more hatred, and unleashed all that weight onto her daughters, as if they were responsible for her misfortune. The next morning, Susanna's screams filled the house as usual. Clara, trembling, held Alice tightly against her chest, trying to protect her as their mother raged. Susanna was beside herself while looking at little Alice, whose only fault was being a fragile and innocent child, with her heart in her throat. Clara tried to calm her sister while watching her mother with fearful eyes. "Please, Mama, don't yell at her. She's just a baby," Clara said quietly, summoning courage she didn't even know she had. Susanna looked at her with unbridled fury. But something in Clara's gaze stopped her, even if only for a second. That moment was enough for Clara to know she had to keep protecting her sister. She knew that one day she would find a way to do so. "Someday, I'll take you away from here, Alice," Clara murmured, tears in her eyes as she cradled her sister. In that house, each day was a battle, but Clara was determined to fight. She knew her mother had not always been this way. She understood that beneath all that pain and anger was a broken woman, but that didn't change the fact that it was her daughters who suffered the consequences. Susanna was not merely a cruel mother, she was a woman betrayed by life itself. Yet, as her pain transformed into rage, it was the little souls of Clara and Alice that bore the deepest scars. Every scream, every tear, every night of terror built a wall of fear around those girls, a wall Clara dreamed of tearing down one day. For Alice's sake and her own, the story was not over. This was just the beginning of a struggle that grew fiercer with each passing day. Over time, life at home became a true hell. Susanna, the woman who once had hope in her heart, had fallen into a chasm so deep that she no longer saw a way out. Instead of fighting for her daughters and trying to give them a decent life, she had taken the worst path, resorting to stealing without remorse, taking what wasn't hers whenever she could. At other times, she simply lay inert at home, showing no interest in improving her situation. It was as if Susanna's soul had completely extinguished. She didn't care if Clara or Alice ate or not, she didn't care if they were well or unwell. The woman who had once been a mother now seemed like a ghost, her heart a cold, impenetrable rock. The cruelest thing, the most heartbreaking for Clara, was that Susanna forced her to work the streets at just 12 years old. Little Clara, who should still be in school or playing like any other girl her age, was compelled to face the cruel and merciless world. Day after day, under the scorching sun or in the rain, Clara sold candies on the busiest avenues, trying to earn a bit of money. Each day was a battle, and each coin she earned was a miracle. Before leaving the house, Susanna looked at her coldly, without a hint of affection. "Clara, don't come back without money," she ordered in a dry tone, not even looking her in the eyes. "If you don't bring something today, we don't eat. Do you understand?" Clara simply nodded in silence, swallowing her tears, knowing that she had no choice. She had no choice. If she didn't bring money home, Alice wouldn't eat that day, and the mere thought of seeing her sister go hungry broke her heart. No matter how much fear she felt, no matter how tired she was, Clara had to keep going with her little box of candies in hand. She stepped out into the street, walking among the crowd, seeing the indifferent gazes of the people passing by. Every day was the same. She extended her hand, offered her candies, but many ignored her as if she didn't exist. The worst part was that she not only had to face the disdain of adults but also the cruelty of other children. One afternoon, while trying to sell some candies on a corner, a group of street kids surrounded her. Their faces reflected the harshness of those who, like her, struggled to survive. "Give me that," shouted one of the older boys, pushing her mercilessly. Clara stumbled and fell to the ground, her candies rolling all over the sidewalk. Before she could get up, the kids had already taken everything. It was the first time something like this had happened to her, but it hurt more each time. She felt injustice crushing her. It was as if the whole world was against her. She looked at the scattered candies and felt a knot in her throat, but she didn't cry. She couldn't cry. She had learned to swallow her pain. "What am I going to do now?" she murmured, sitting on the ground, looking at the coins she didn't have, the money she couldn't take home. She knew that if she returned empty-handed, Susanna wouldn't greet her with understanding or comfort. There would be no hug or kind word, only shouts, reproaches, and perhaps something worse. But beyond the fear of her mother, what worried her most was Alice. If she didn't earn any money, her sister wouldn't eat. Clara couldn't bear the thought of seeing her cry from hunger, of hearing her little stomach growl while she tried to console her. "I have to do it for Alice," she told herself, standing up with determination. Despite the humiliation, despite the fear she felt, Clara knew she had to keep going. She couldn't allow herself to give up. She couldn't let the world defeat her. Even though her legs trembled and her heart raced with shame, she did the only thing left to do. She began to beg. "Please, help, anything," she said in a barely audible voice, extending her hand to the passers-by who walked by without even looking at her. Some tossed her a coin, but others didn't even see her. Each coin that fell into her hand was a small victory. But each rejection felt like a dagger in her heart. At the end of the day, when she managed to gather a few coins, she returned home with her head down but with the satisfaction of knowing that she had done her best. Less than Alice would eat that night. When she entered her house, she was greeted by the cold silence of Susanna, who barely gave her a glance. "Mom, I got this," Clara said, her trembling hands showing the coins she had managed to gather. Susanna took them without even thanking her. It was as if Clara existed only as a tool, as a way to get money. You better bring more tomorrow, her mother said harshly. This isn't enough. Clara nodded silently, feeling a mix of sadness and exhaustion. She had no strength to argue or complain. She simply lowered her head and walked to the corner where Alice was waiting, her eyes filled with innocence and hope. She hugged her little sister tightly, feeling that this fragile little body was the only thing keeping her standing. The only thing giving her strength to keep fighting. I promise that one day we'll leave here, Clara whispered to Alice as she cradled her in her arms. One day we'll get away from Mom and all of this. We'll live in a nice place where there's always food and where no one makes you cry. But deep down, Clara knew that day was still somewhat distant, an impossible dream, and in the meantime, she had to keep facing life every day, for Alice, for herself. For a future she longed for with all her strength, but which felt increasingly out of reach. One day, after spending hours under the sun selling candies and cleaning windows on the streets, Clara returned home with tired feet and a body worn out. It had been another difficult day, just like the ones before, but something in her heart made her feel more exhausted than usual. The house was completely silent when she pushed open the wooden door, which creaked as it opened. And that silence felt strange. Alice was always there with her sweet little voice running towards her, but that afternoon she heard nothing. Clara quickly glanced at the old chair where her mother always sat. There was Susanna, like a motionless shadow, with that cold expression that terrified her so much. But what truly made her blood boil was the absence of her little sister. Alice wasn't there. There was no trace of her anywhere. Clara's heart began to race, too fast. And she felt fear taking hold of her. "Mom, where is Alice?" she asked, trying to control the despair that was beginning to form in her chest. Susanna barely moved her head. She didn't even look at her, seeming indifferent as if she didn't understand the question. Clara began to walk quickly through the small house, opening the door to the room where they used to sleep, hoping to find her sister wrapped in her blanket. But the space was empty. She ran to the kitchen, checked the corners, even looked under the bed, but there was not a single sign of Alice. Panic was now complete. "Alice," Clara called with a trembling voice. "Alice, please tell me where you are." The silence was terrifying. She couldn't think clearly. Everything was crumbling in her mind. Her little sister was gone, and the fear that something terrible had happened paralyzed her. She returned to where her mother was, her eyes filled with tears, getting closer, searching for answers. She needed Susanna to speak. She needed to know what was happening. "Mom," Clara pleaded, "where is Alice?" Susanna finally looked up, and with a coldness that sent a shiver down Clara's spine, she responded with a calm that terrified her even more. "I took her to an alley," said Susanna, as if it were of no importance. "Some men will pick her up there, and then they'll pay me when they bring her back." Clara felt her world shatter into pieces. She couldn't understand, and she didn't want to understand. Her mother's words were a dagger piercing through her. What was she saying? What did that mean? Her little sister, sweet Alice, in the hands of men. The horror she felt in that moment was indescribable. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Her whole being was paralyzed by fear, disgust, confusion. "What are you saying?" Clara felt the words barely leaving her mouth. "What have you done to Alice?" Susanna looked at her without a trace of remorse in her eyes. "It's easy money," she said dismissively, as if it were the most obvious answer in the world. "Don't worry, by the end of the night, they'll bring her back safe." Her mother's voice sounded so cold, so indifferent, that Clara could hardly believe what she was hearing. How could her mother speak of her sister as if she were an object? She was a child, but that didn't seem to matter to Susanna. Clara took a step back, staggering, feeling tears begin to flow down her face, though she couldn't stop looking at her mother, hoping it was all a bad dream from which she would soon wake. "She's my sister," Clara shouted with a desperation she had never felt before. "She's just a child. You can't do this." Susanna sighed, as if tired of her daughter's screams, as if all of this were an annoyance to her. "Stop making a fuss," she replied coldly. "It's what needs to be done to survive, and you'll understand someday. We have no other choice." Clara couldn't accept those words. Each one felt like a slap. Her mother was justifying the unjustifiable. She had reduced Alice, her small and defenseless sister, to a commodity, a mere exchange for money. All the love, all the sacrifice Clara had made to protect her now meant nothing. The image of Alice crying somewhere dark, in the hands of strangers, haunted her thoughts. The pain tormented her. It was unbearable. "You can't do this," Clara shouted again, feeling her chest ache with every breath. "She's your daughter." But Susanna remained unmoved, as if she had no soul, as if all that might have once been good in her had evaporated. All that was left was cold calculation. "We do what we have to do, Clara. This is how it is. There's no turning back." Clara fell to her knees, drained of strength, her body trembling. Her mind couldn't process the horror. Tears kept falling, and she felt the world around her growing smaller, darker. "Alice, I'm sorry," Clara murmured, hugging the ground as if that could alleviate the weight on her heart. "I'm so sorry." Her tears fell silently, but each one was a scream of desperation. She knew she couldn't stay still. She couldn't let her sister suffer this way. But what could she do? Fear had her trapped, and reality felt so cruel and unreachable. "I have to save her. I have to save Alice," she whispered through sobs. Even though everything was against her, and the horror seemed endless, Clara knew she couldn't give up. She had to fight. She had to find a way to protect her sister because, despite all the suffering, a spark of hope still burned deep in her heart. Alice depended on her, and Clara wouldn't leave her alone. Not this time. Over time, what should have been unthinkable became Clara's daily routine. The horror no longer surprised her. But her heart still tore apart again and again. Alice, small and fragile, cried inconsolably every time Clara carried her, in her arms. On their way to the alley, the little legs stumbled, and the tiny arms clung to her sister as if sensing the danger awaiting them. Each whimper from the baby was like a dagger to Clara's chest, and the helplessness was unbearable. She felt a mix of rage, guilt, and sadness. A sensation that suffocated her, yet always. The fear of her mother paralyzed her. "I'm sorry, Alice. I promise that one day we'll get out of here. One day, I'll get you out of this," she said. But those words, though filled with love, felt empty. Day by day, that promise seemed increasingly impossible to fulfill. The fear of her cold and ruthless mother kept Clara trapped. She knew that if she rebelled, if she tried to escape or tell someone what was happening, her mother would take revenge in the worst way. She had seen what Susanna was capable of, and just the thought of what she might do made Clara tremble. But despite it all, every time Alice cried in her arms, Clara felt a part of her die a little more. When Clara returned home after leaving Alice with those men, the weight of it all pressed heavily on her. She was greeted with her usual indifference. Susanna barely lifted her gaze from her spot in the house. "It's what we have to do to survive. Don't be foolish, Clara, this is how it is," Susanna said without looking at her. Clara swallowed her anguish, shrinking silently, and went to her room. How could her mother talk about her own daughter, her sister, as if it were just a transaction, as if Alice were an interchangeable object for a few miserable coins? But every time she tried to resist, every time she gathered the courage to say enough, Susanna looked at her with that coldness that made her back down. Fear always won, until one day, something changed. It was an afternoon like so many others, but something in the air felt different. Clara walked with Alice in her arms, more exhausted than ever. The baby cried inconsolably, and each of her whimpers was like a cry for help, urging Clara to do something about it. She couldn't ignore it. Her own sobs mixed with her sister's, but she no longer bothered to hide them. She was broken. The alley loomed in the distance, that dark shadow hanging over their lives like a nightmare. Clara felt her legs barely able to move, the weight of Alice and guilt dragging her down further. But then something caught her attention. Across the street, parked at a corner, there was a police car. 2 officers were inside, chatting calmly, unaware of the horror unfolding so close to them. Clara stopped dead in her tracks. Her heart began to beat so hard that she could almost hear it in her ears. A spark of hope ignited in her chest. She looked at Alice, who continued to cry in her arms. And then back at the police. She knew she had to do something. She knew this was her chance. But fear, that damned fear, invaded her once more. What if she spoke up? What if she dared to report what her mother was doing? What would happen next? Susanna would take revenge. That she knew for certain. What would her mother do when she found out that Clara had betrayed her? Fear enveloped her like a dense fog, incapacitating her. No, I can't do it, she thought, staggering with fear while holding Alice. But then her sister's cries made her react. Alice looked at her with innocent eyes, not understanding what was happening, not knowing why her own mother was condemning her to a life of suffering. Clara felt a rush of courage surge through her body. She couldn't keep allowing this to happen. She couldn't remain a prisoner of fear. She looked once more at the police and then at her sister. Alice's cries echoed in her ears, and something inside her broke. The love for her sister was stronger than the fear, stronger than the oppression that had paralyzed her for so long. No more, she whispered, clenching her teeth, tears in her eyes. No more, taking a deep breath, and before she could think twice, her legs began to move. She crossed the street. Her heart was beating so fast it felt like it was going to burst from her chest. Every step she took toward the police car felt like a small victory, a sign that fear wouldn't win this time. She knew everything would change after this. Her life as she knew it would shatter into 1,000 pieces, but she didn't care. The only thing that mattered was saving Alice. When she reached the car, one of the officers rolled down the window and looked at her with curiosity. "What's wrong, little one?" he asked, noticing the distress in Clara's eyes as she held the crying baby. Clara swallowed hard, feeling her voice tremble. The words were stuck in her throat, but she knew she had to say it. She couldn't back down now. "Please," she said in a shaky voice, tears rolling down her face. "Help me," with her heart about to explode and her voice trembling. Clara gathered all the courage she had left and began to tell the officers what she had never told anyone. Each word that left her lips felt like a blow to her own chest, but she knew she could no longer hold back this secret. She explained how her mother forced her to work on the streets every day, selling candy and cleaning cars without rest or mercy. She spoke of the long hours under the sun and rain, the hunger, the exhaustion. "But that's not the worst," Clara said, her voice breaking. "My mom rents out my little sister." The officers exchanged surprised glances but let Clara continue. "There are men," Clara said, swallowing hard with trembling hands. "They come and take Alice. They give her to some women, and they ask for money with my sister in their arms, making her pass as their daughter." One of the officers, shocked, looked at her closely as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "What does your mother do with the money?" he asked, trying to stay calm. Clara lowered her gaze to the ground, as if afraid to say it out loud. "She spends it on alcohol, on parties. She doesn't care about Alice, she doesn't care about me. All she cares about is that money she makes, and she does whatever it takes to get it." The silence that followed was heavy, laden with guilt and horror. The officers, used to hearing terrible stories, couldn't help but feel moved by the harshness of it all. Clara had just confessed, such a small girl with such a heavy burden on her shoulders. One of the officers, moved by her bravery, knelt in front of her, trying to offer some comfort. "We're going to help you, Clara," he said firmly, with a tenderness Clara hadn't heard in a long time. "This is going to end today, I promise." Although fear still lingered in her chest, Clara felt a glimmer of hope. She knew her mother wouldn't sit idly by if she found out what was happening. But it was time to do something, to protect Alice once and for all. She could no longer allow her sister to suffer. The officers quickly devised a plan and explained to Clara what she needed to do. But their words felt distant, as if her mind was trapped in a whirlwind of emotions. "Just do the same as always," one officer told her. "Take your sister to the alley, but we'll be watching, ready to act. Don't worry, we'll be close, no one else will hurt you." Clara swallowed nervously. The officer's words provided some comfort, but she still couldn't shake her fear of what was to come. That afternoon, as usual, Clara walked toward the alley with Alice in her arms. But this time something felt different. Though fear still enveloped her, she knew she wasn't alone. The police were watching, ready to intervene at any moment. Alice, unaware of everything, cried in Clara's arms, kicking as if she sensed the horror about to unfold. "Just a little longer. It'll all be over soon, Alice, I promise," Clara whispered. When they reached the alley, the men were already there as always. The leader, a tall, scruffy man approached with that cold smile that terrified Clara. "Here's the girl," he said without even looking at Clara as he extended his arms to take Alice. Clara trembled but did what she had to do. With shaking hands, she handed her sister over once more, trying to keep the storm that loomed ahead from her mind. But before the men could take another step, everything changed in an instant. Suddenly, the alley filled with police-like shadows emerging from every corner. The officers pounced on the men, subduing them before they could react. One officer snatched Alice from the man's arms, cradling her gently while the others handcuffed the men and forced them to the ground. Shouts, orders, the sound of handcuffs clicking. It all happened in a matter of seconds. Clara stood frozen, watching the scene with her heart in her throat. Clara could hardly believe what she was seeing. Her sister was safe, and the men who had caused them so much harm were now being arrested. For the first time in a long while, she felt she could breathe, but then a heartbreaking scream shattered the moment. Clara turned around to see her mother, Susanna, running toward them with a face twisted in rage. She had discovered what had happened and was filled with fury. "Let my girls go," Susanna screamed, pushing against the police officers trying to stop her. "They're mine." Clara recoiled, fear returning suddenly. Susanna, out of control, was trying to fight her way through the officers. But this time they wouldn't let her near her daughters. The police quickly surrounded her, preventing her from advancing. Her screams were furious, filled with rage and desperation. "Alice, Clara," but her words no longer held the power they once did. One officer grabbed her by the arm and, with the same coldness with which he had arrested the men, handcuffed her. "You can't do this to me," Susanna continued to shout, trying to break free, but this time, it was a defense. Clara, trembling, watched as her mother was dragged toward the police car. Still screaming and struggling, the woman who had controlled her life with an iron fist, who had plunged them into an abyss of pain, was now being taken away. Handcuffed and defeated, Susanna had lost all power over them. For the first time in a long time, Clara felt a peace she didn't remember. The hell was over. Alice, now calmer, rested in the arms of a police officer, and Clara, still in disbelief, approached her sister and hugged her tightly, feeling the giant weight lift from her heart. "I promised you, Alice," Clara whispered, tears in her eyes. "We are safe now." In that moment, amidst all the chaos, Clara knew fear no longer controlled them. They were free. Susanna's end was as bleak as her life had been. From the moment they locked her up, her rage overflowed in every corner of the jail. Her screams echoed against the cold walls of her cell, filled with hatred and resentment. She had nothing left to lose, and all she did was unleash her bitterness, as if she wanted everyone to feel the same pain she had carried for so long. But what hurt the most, what tore at her heart, were her mother's words. Every time she opened her mouth, she threw poison daggers straight to her daughter's soul. "I don't care what happens to those damned girls," Susanna roared with seemingly endless rage. "I never wanted them. I never loved them. They always disgusted me." The words hit Clara with the force of a storm. Each scream from her mother was like a slap in the face. Clara felt breathless. She never would have imagined that Susanna could speak with such hatred. She knew their relationship had always been cold and distant. But hearing those words was too much. How could the woman who gave them life say such things? With her heart shattered, Clara clutched her sister Alice tightly, who cried in her arms, oblivious to the storm raging around them. The baby's small hands clung to Clara's neck, seeking comfort without understanding the chaos enveloping them. "Clara and Estella only brought me misfortune. I hate them. I hate them like I hate their miserable father, the coward who left me alone with them." Clara closed her eyes, trying to block out the screams, but her mother's words pierced her mind like daggers. She couldn't help but feel the pain they caused, a pain that consumed her from within. Everything she had lived through, all the suffering and fear, now carried a new weight. Knowing that her mother had never loved them, this realization was even crueler than the years of abuse. The knowledge that her mother had hated them from the beginning, that she had never felt even a hint of love for them, was devastating. Tears began to roll down Clara's cheeks as she hugged Alice tighter, feeling more alone than ever. Her mother's words were like chains binding her in pain, but they also represented the end of a nightmare. Susanna, with all her hatred and venom, no longer had power over them, yet, despite this, the fear still lingered. Clara couldn't shake thoughts of what would come next. Had she done the right thing by telling the police everything? Had she made the best decision? Doubts flooded her like a dark tide threatening to drown her. As Susanna's words faded into the air, Clara looked around, lost. She didn't know what to do or what fate awaited them. She was afraid, deeply and paralyzingly afraid. What would happen to them now? Would they be separated? That thought ripped the air from her lungs. She couldn't bear the idea of Alice being taken away. She had fought so hard to protect her, and now, when it finally seemed she was safe, the fear of losing her consumed her. What are we going to do now? She whispered. Clara's words were choked by tears as she gently stroked her little sister's hair. Alice, I don't want to lose you. I can't. The baby continued to sob softly, not understanding the pain her older sister was carrying. Clara held her tightly, constantly questioning if all this had been a mistake. Had she done the right thing by reporting their mother? She knew they couldn't keep living like this, but the fear of the unknown was overwhelming. Who would take care of them now? Where would they live? Suddenly, one of the officers approached Clara slowly. His expression was gentle and understanding. He knew the girl was going through a terrible moment and wanted to offer her some comfort. Clara said in a calm voice, lowering herself to his level, "We're going to take you to a safe place. No one will hurt you. You're safe now." Clara looked up with tear-filled eyes and a trembling voice. "They're going to separate us. I don't want to be away from my little sister. I can't." The officer shook his head, trying to soothe her distress. "We will do everything we can to prevent that, but we need to make sure you're both okay, that you're safe." Clara nodded, though tears continued to stream down her cheeks. She knew the officers were trying to help her, and despite the lingering fear inside, she had to learn to trust them. As the officer spoke to her, Susanna's screams from the cell grew increasingly distant. Her mother, who had been a terrifying figure in her life, was now just a crumbling shadow consumed by her own hatred. Clara knew Susanna could no longer hurt them, but that didn't erase the pain she had left behind. "I promise you, Alice, we're safe now. No one will hurt us." The officer gestured for Clara to follow him, and with Alice in her arms, Clara began to walk into the unknown. Each step felt like a leap into the void. She didn't know what awaited them or if they would ever live without fear, but deep down, something told her that the worst was behind them, though the future was uncertain. For the first time in a long while, Clara felt a small spark of hope after all the pain and suffering they had endured. Clara and Alice were rescued. The nightmares that had marked their lives until that moment came to an end when a loving, compassionate, and understanding family adopted them. This family understood the pain both girls had endured. They not only provided a new home but also a chance to start anew. What had been a hellish existence filled with fear and screams gradually dissipated like a storm finally giving way to calm. The transition wasn't easy, at first. Clara still felt the weight of years of suffering on her small shoulders. She had lived so long under Susanna's control, filled with fear and pain, that learning to trust again became an enormous challenge. Sometimes, Clara would wake in the middle of the night, heart racing, fearing it was all a dream and that they would soon return to that dark corner or that Susanna would appear again, reclaiming her control. But in those moments of panic, what calmed her was little Alice, the baby who was beginning to walk with her unsteady steps. She always found a way to cling to Clara, as if she knew her sister was her protector, her anchor amidst it all. With her innocent eyes, Alice began to discover the world in a way she had never known, free from pain. And every time Clara heard her laugh, something in her heart eased. The new family, consisting of two loving parents, offered them something they had never had: security. Each day was a new opportunity to heal. The warm arms, words of encouragement, and simple moments like family dinners or afternoons playing in the garden were little miracles for them. Although the shadow of Susanna sometimes lurked in their thoughts, they now had the certainty that darkness was behind them. One afternoon, while Clara watched Alice playing on the grass in the garden, the adoptive mother approached and sat beside her. "How do you feel, Clara?" she asked gently. Noticing the thoughtful look on the girl's face, Clara, still learning to express herself without fear, took a moment to respond. "I feel better," she said softly but sincerely. I'm not as scared as before. Here, I'm not afraid." The woman smiled, knowing that for Clara to admit that was a significant step. She gently stroked Clara's hair and embraced her. "You will never have to be afraid again, sweetheart. This is your home now, and we will always be here for you and Alice." Clara closed her eyes for a moment, savoring the warmth of that hug. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to feel peace. She knew it wouldn't be easy and that the scars of her past wouldn't disappear overnight, but she also knew she was no longer alone. She had Alice, and she had a family that cared for them. She loved the days that followed, filled with small moments of healing. Clara began to discover what it was like to laugh without fear, and although the emotional scars were still present, they now held a new meaning. They were a testament to their survival and to the fact that, despite everything, they were still standing. One day, while Clara was in her room looking out the window, Alice approached her, wobbling with a smile on her face. Clara lifted her into her arms and looked into her eyes. "Everything is going to be okay, Alice. We're safe now." The sun gently streamed through the window, illuminating the room with a warm and peaceful light. For the first time, Clara allowed herself to dream of a different future, one in which fear didn't dictate every step they took. It had been a long and painful journey, but now both Clara and Alice could see that the worst was behind them, and while the scars of their past would remain, they knew they could start anew. Life had given them a second chance, a chance to live free from pain and fear. Finally, after so much suffering, they could begin to build a future filled with hope. After watching the story above, do you have any thoughts? Feel free to share your opinions in the comments section. If you enjoyed our video, please like, subscribe, and share our channel. That's all about today's stories. See you next time.